all right? And we'll change the view. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to provide some overall context for the holiday and then move into the Passover Haggadah. So there are a lot of holidays in the year, and if you are an observant Jew and you work in a non-Jewish place, sometimes people are stunned to hear how many days you want to take off. What, another holiday? Are you kidding? And another holiday, and so on. So I want to put them in the following context. In some ways, other than the minor holidays like Hanukkah and Purim, there are really two holidays in the year, two big holidays, which can be subdivided into smaller parts. There's a fall holiday and a spring holiday. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's look at the fall holiday. The fall holiday, there's a run up to it before, but it's really Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret. That series of holidays can be embraced in a larger sense. So what is it? And what I want to suggest to you is it is about our relationship to God and the world as human beings, not just as Jews. The fall holidays are more universal. And so just to give you an example, on Yom Kippur, we talk about how all the creatures of the world come before God, and God judges them one by one as a shepherd passes the sheep pass before the shepherd, so we pass before God. And there's a sense there that it's all creatures, it's all humanity is being judged. And all of us need to take maximum advantage of the time we have on earth, right? And so that theme, which is, and it's a new year, and it's not a new year for the Jewish people.
No.
Right? It's the anniversary of the creation of the world, actually of human beings, the anniversary of the creation of Adam on the sixth day of creation. So there we have a sense that there is a holiday, which is a holiday for all humanity. One other thing you might think, well, Sukkot is not a universal holiday, but in fact, if you count the number of bowls that were offered on the altar, there are 70 of them, and those 70 bowls are meant to represent what in antiquity was believed were the 70 nations on earth, right? One sacrifice on behalf of each nation, and according to the prophets, in the end of time, all people will come to recognize God, and they will come to worship God in Jerusalem. When? On Sukkot, right? So and beyond that, the focus of some of the texts are universal. So for example, the climactic text on Yom Kippur, which is the book of Jonah, is not about Jews. It's about the repentance of the people of Nineveh, who were not Jewish at all, in fact, an ancient enemy of the Jews. Okay, so the fall holidays, universal. They start with the New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and they end with a Torah festival. And that Torah festival, of course, is Simchat Torah, when we finish reading the Torah and we begin it all over again. In the spring, and now we're coming to our own time, we start with actually a new year, because the month of Nisan, the month that we are in, the month of Pesach, is biblically a new year. And there's a buildup to it. And then on the night of the 14th, we have Passover beginning. And Passover is not universal. Passover is about the specific Jewish experience, the Israelite experience of being brought out of Egypt into the wilderness, and ultimately going to the promised land. So I want to ask everybody to be sure to be muted.
I will.
Let me see here. I'm going to mute everybody. Okay, so you're all muted, whether you chose to or not. Okay, so spring holiday starts with Pesach, so actually a little bit before, with the New Year, biblical New Year. Then we celebrate a moment, the birth really of the Jewish people As God brings us out of Egypt, we're no longer just the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but we're not tribes, we're a people, an entire people. B'nai Yisrael, that's what we're referred to for the first time when we leave Egypt, the nation, the people of Israel. And then the culmination of that spring holiday, we count out the Omer, 49 days, and on the 50th day, we have Shavuot, which commemorates a Jewish experience, the culmination really in some ways of the Exodus. Yes, we'll make it to the promised land, but perhaps even more important, we receive the Torah. So again, we start with the new year, we end with a Torah festival, but this time, unlike the fall, which is universal, the spring is particular. Okay, so much for the overall sort of cycle of the year. Now let's talk about Passover and the Exodus from Egypt. And what I'd like to say, first of all, is that if you look at the account in the book of Exodus, and even we've seen a bit of it in Numbers, and you'll see it again in Deuteronomy, we can ascertain a series of reasons why God took us out of Egypt. The first is, of course, salvation. We were enslaved, we were suffering, they were murdering our children, and God came in and delivered us. Secondly, we have the idea that God is interested not only in taking us out, but God is interested in demonstrating God's power, the fact that God is the God of the world, the creator of the universe, and demonstrating that publicly, right? So that the nations of the world will know, that everyone will acknowledge God's power, God's might, God's glory, and so on. So, and that's clearly a reason. And as you know, because we studied it a little bit, Moses will invoke that idea when God is threatening to destroy the people. And so God says, Moses says, if you do that, what will the nations say? Right? That you brought them out of Egypt only to kill them in the wilderness, right? And so this second idea, not only to save us, but to demonstrate God's power, is another reason why we're brought out of Egypt. Thirdly, it is, I think, about empathy. It's about reminding us of our own oppression so that we will have empathy for others who are oppressed. Remember the stranger, the Torah says, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt, right? We see this among the rabbis a lot, where they want to, there is this sense that this experience, as terrible as it was, should have taught us something, right? You could make a contemporary, at least 20th century analogy. What do we take away from the Holocaust? One of the things we say is never again, not to us, not to anyone, right? And so as Elie Wiesel reminded us, genocide, whether against Jews or anyone else, has to be stopped, and that we, having experienced it, need to have empathy for other people who are also experiencing it, and we need to do what we can to prevent it. All right, so far we have salvation, right? We have demonstrating God's mastery in the world, we have empathy, and then the last reason for the Exodus is looking ahead, and that is so that the descendants of the Israelites who were saved will know, right? That is one of the reasons for the Exodus, is so that we should remember it and we should pass it down. And of course, when we talk about the seder, that is one of, if not the major reason for the seder, is that we are passing down from generation to generation the memory of what was done to us. And that idea is intrinsic already in the description of the Exodus. For example, and I'm going to come back to this, God says to the Israelites to slaughter a lamb, to put its blood on the doorposts. And when your children, this is in the book of Exodus, when your children ask, what is this that you're doing? You're supposed to say, because it is because of what God did for me when God took me out of the land of Egypt, right? So already at the beginning, we have this idea, before it's even happened, before the Exodus has even taken place, we have this idea that part of the reason for it is to preserve the memory of it. Okay, so let's talk about the seder itself. Seder means order, because what we have is a series of actions which are done in a specific order, right? The book that we use is called the Haggadah, right? And Haggadah doesn't exactly mean telling, or at least not like telling a story, right? Telling a story, to tell a story is lisaper, right? This is lahagid, right, in Hebrew, right? Two different verbs. Lisaper is to retell, to tell a story. But as you know, I think if you look at the Haggadah, we're not actually telling the story. We don't go from the beginning. You might think the most logical thing to do on the evening of Passover is to open the book of Exodus, start reading at chapter 12, and just go through the story up to perhaps when God divides the sea, right? But we don't do that. And so what we're doing is not exactly telling the story. We're doing something else. And that is to embellish the story using specific verses, using a rabbinic technique called midrash. And we've talked about midrash lots of times as we've looked at various passages, and I've said, well, the rabbis made a midrash about this or about that, right? And what we have, and I'm going to give you some examples, what we have in the Haggadah is not telling the story in a chronological way, but using certain verses and digging out new meaning from them in order to expand on the story. We have that statement in the Passover Haggadah, whoever embellishes it, the more, the better. We have the story of the rabbi sitting around in Bnei Brak all night long, right, doing this, right? And if all they had to do was read the story from the book of Exodus, well, it certainly wouldn't have taken all night long, right? So the process, and the process of midrash is not a passive process. It's not like you sit and listen to someone who's reading or telling the story. It's much more active, and I'll give you some examples of that as well. Again, it's called the Haggadah. Lahagid is in some ways to give testimony, right? Testify. This is our annual testifying. And what are we testifying to? All those four things I mentioned earlier about the Exodus. The other thing is that the name, the Haggadah, also comes from a specific mitzvah, which is actually repeated a number of times, and that is V'higareta lavincha, and you should tell or testify to your child, right? You hear the word V'higareta Haggadah, right? You should Haggadah to your children. So that's why it's called the Haggadah or the Passover Haggadah, or however you want to pronounce it. Now, I'm going to pause for just a minute for questions at this point. And okay, just give me a second. I want to get rid of this. Okay, why am I? Let me get rid of this as well. Okay, and now go to this view. Okay, good. Any questions? Everybody's muted. So if you do have a question or a comment, unmute. And if not, we're going to, yes, Sandy, go ahead.
Well, just a comment. It's just sad that God doesn't show God's power nowadays, like, Holocaust, the Ukraine,
Yes, yes. And that is an excellent point. And why does God remove God's self from history in that way? And it's a better question that I have an answer to. But I will say this, that the Jewish tradition teaches us, and that the way God works in the world is through people. That we, in fact, so there's this famous joke, which you've probably heard it, but I'll retell it because it makes the point so well. There is a man of deep faith who is on a boat, which sinks in a lake or the ocean or wherever. And this person who's treading water says, God, I've been a good Jew my whole life, save me. And so what happens is that some kind of ocean liner sees or another boat, and they send him a lifeline, and he says, no, God save me. Right? I don't want some boat. And then there is another situation where someone tries to save him. A helicopter comes. No, save me. And then he dies. And he says to God, why didn't you save me? And God says, what are you talking about? I sent you a boat. I sent you a helicopter, right? And the idea is that's how God works in the world. And therefore, in some ways, not to let God off the hook, right? But it is our responsibility to react to these things. There's a statement also, and this is more relevant to the story of the Exodus. The people are standing at the sea and they're terrified. And Moses, because the Egyptians are chasing them and the sea is in front of them. And Moses says, watch now, God's going to do a great thing. And God says, what are you talking to me for? Get going. Right? And it's only when they take action that God takes action and the sea is split. Okay, if there are no other questions,
Thank you.
I'm going to resume and now talk particularly about the seder. So what I want to say is, and there are a lot of fours, and I want to suggest not only, for questions for children and so on, but there are, I think, 4 basic reasons why we have a seder. The first one is about education. It's about telling your children and passing on to the next generation, which was, as I said, one of the basic reasons for the Exodus. But there are at least 3 others. The second one I want to suggest to you is that it is a kind of celebration and acknowledgement of God and what God did for us. And just to point, it's like a testimonial dinner. You have an honoree, everybody comes together, and you focus on that honoree and all that they have done, right? So this is, in a sense, a testimonial dinner, but it's a testimonial dinner for God, right? And what we are doing is recounting the things that God did for us. And that's one reason, I think, why we don't see Moses in the Passover Haggadah, which is really striking, right? Moses is the one, he was in the front, he led us, right? All of that. And yet he's not mentioned. I think this is like, you're honoring the superintendent of schools. You don't spend your time talking about a principal, right? Moses was acting as God's agent. And this idea that the Seder is, in part, a kind of a testimonial dinner for God, we can see most clearly in one of the things which is, I think, most familiar to us in the Passover Haggadah. So familiar, in fact, that the melody is sometimes played at simchas by bands that don't know very much Jewish music. Die, Dayenu, die, Dayenu, right? So what is the language of Dayenu? Dayenu is what? If you had taken us out of Egypt, but not brought us to the sea, it would have been enough. But you not only brought us to the sea, you brought us through the sea on dry land, and that would have been enough, etc. So what are we doing? We're recounting all of the things that the honoree, God, did for us, right? And there you see that I think most clearly. So passing it on to the next generation, right? The educational function. We have then the testimonial function. The third thing is that we are meant to, in some sense, at least symbolically, re-experience the Exodus. We are meant to kind of put ourselves back in the place of our ancestors. You see this when in the Passover Haggadah, when he says, this is what God did for me when God took me out of Egypt. And yet this is being said 1,000 years later, right? Because in some sense, we want to feel it as though we personally, individually were saved, just as our people was saved. So there is this idea of re-experience, and we see it explicitly in a statement in the Haggadah, B'chol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. In every generation, a person is to see themselves as though they went out of Egypt, right? So that's the third level. And one of the, why is it that we eat matzah, right? Because we want to taste what our ancestors taste. Why do we eat maror? Because the Egyptians embittered their lives, and we want to taste that bitterness, right? So this too, this is the idea of re-experiencing. And now the fourth level, right? So far we've got education, we've got a testimonial dinner to God, we've got re-experiencing. And now, and this is the one that I think most people miss, right? And the reason is that lots of people end their seder with the meal. And then they've eaten and they're tired, and what time is it? And so maybe they'll sing a couple of songs, Haggadah or Adirhu or something little, or who knows one, right? But they're basically done. The problem is that the Passover Seder can be divided into two parts. The part before the meal, which is about the past, what God did for us, and the part after the meal, which is about the future. The part after the meal is about the Messiah, about bringing a time where there's peace and where the Jewish people will not be oppressed anymore, and where there's no anti-Semitism, right? And you see that after the meal in a number of places. We open the door, Elijah, right? We say Elijah's coming in. Well, who is Elijah? Elijah the prophet? In the rabbinic mind, he is the one who will be there to announce that the Messiah is here, right? And what we're saying is that we want to see the deliverance that took place for our ancestors as a paradigm for what will take place in the future. Just as you redeemed our ancestors from slavery to freedom, we are saying after the meal, now redeem us from this world of pain and oppression and bring us, just as you brought them, bring us now into the Messianic era. Right? So that's the last level here, which is the level of Messianism. It's about the future, right? Okay, so I'm sure there's more going on, but the number 4 is a good number because we see it again and again. So in a moment, I want to go into some specific parts of the Haggadah. But before I do that, I'm going to open it to any questions or comments that you have so far. and then we'll dig into the text itself. Anything at all? Yeah, Walter and then Barry. Go ahead, Walter. You have to unmute.
Rabbi, you say that God works through people.
Yes.
Wouldn't it be obvious to include Moses? In other words,
Yes, yes, it would be obvious if our function was really to tell the story, right? Then Moses should be there front and center. But if one of our purposes here is not so much telling the story as transmitting to the next generation and so on, and particularly if we want to spend this time praising God, who is actually the one who delivered us, right? Moses is just a way that God did that. And we understand that's how God works, through people. Right. But it is God's doing, right? That's the point. It's God's doing, right? That's how God manifests in the world, through people. And so I think the Haggadah, I mean, you want to hear about Moses? Come to shul, because the Torah reading is all about Moses, right? It's not that this exists. This is our only way of remembering the Exodus. You have the seder the next morning, you come to shul and we have the whole story, right?
Right.
And then on the seventh day, we'll finish it with going through the sea. I mean, I think your point is well taken, but in fact, it's, I think for this evening, at this particular moment, our focus is not on Moses. Barry, you were going to ask something. Again, unmute, please.
Sorry. Yes, my recollection is that Moses is mentioned once in the Haggadah.
Yes, he's mentioned once. I think it's in Hallel. He's not mentioned in a direct way. And the focus is not on him. It's not what he said. It's not what he did. Right? Yes, you're correct. Okay. So unless anybody else has something, let's go to the Haggadah itself now, and we're going to look at some texts. And the first text I want to look at, and I'll be reading them out to you in English, so there's no need for you to have it unless you have a Haggadah. If you do, then the first text I want to look at, which comes, it usually comes right at the beginning of the seder. Halachma Onya. It's in Aramaic, right, which was the spoken language of the Jews in the time of the rabbis. Right? The rabbis created the seder. Right? Halachma Onya. This is the bread of poverty or persecution or affliction. I think the older translations tend to be affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Let all who are hungry come and eat. Let all who are in need come and share the Passover meal. This year we are here, next year in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves, next year we are free, right? So the focus is on the matzah. And here we uncover the matzah, because what we're saying is, this is the bread of affliction. This is the matzah. Now, all who are hungry, let them come and eat, right? Is the idea that this is a shared experience. And this is also, I think, about empathy, right? One of the things we were supposed to take away from our experience in Egypt. And who are those who are most like slaves in our time? Now, of course, there are slaves in our time, right? And I don't want to fail to acknowledge that. But really, in our general experience, who are people most like slaves? And they are poor people who can't really control their lives. They don't have many choices, right? They're always just trying to survive. So in some sense, the Exodus is meant to give us a sense of shared experience with them and empathy for them. And it's not surprising that we start the Seder here and that it's in the vernacular. It's in the language that those people would understand. And we had an obligation to try to invite people like that to our Seder, It's not that we're making a proclamation and we just expect them to come, but this is a reminder to ourselves that we should be sharing what we have with them. Okay. Now, we're going to go through until we come to the end, and then we're going to turn to Hebrew, right? When we say next year, may we be free people. So I want to say that there's something else going on here. And that is, if you look at the last bottom section, this year we are here, next year in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves, next year free. So when I say this year we are here, I'm pretty clear. I'm at the seder table. That's where I am. I'm here. And next year in Israel, L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, right? But then the next statement, this year we are slaves. Where am I now? I am in Egypt, right? Next year, let us be free. In other words, in Halachma Onya, what we are doing is time traveling. What we are doing here is beginning the process where we're told in every generation a person should see themselves as though they personally went out of Egypt. I taught this once to a religious school class. And then there was a kid who kind of, you could see the light bulb go off over his head, he got it. And he said, it's a portal, Rabbi, it's a portal, right? Something that you could use to travel. And what is that portal? I want to suggest to you, it's the matzah. In other words, you're there and you're pointing, this is the bread of affliction. And then it is as though, think about this cinematically. What happens? The matzah kind of blurs. And then you're back in Egypt and the matzah is there. You're standing around and the same matzah is there, right? The matzah is what helps you, right, to travel back. This is what our ancestors ate. This is what we are eating. So much for Halachma Onya. This is the bread of affliction. And now we're going to come to everybody's favorite part, at least if you're a kid, and that is the Manishtana, right? Which are usually called the 4 questions. I say usually called because I want to tell you that if you look at the source of the Manishtana, it is in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, and it's not like the Talmud has the Passover seder all in it, but it has certain parts of it, because that's the earliest place where we find some parts of the seder. And I want to give you what it says about the exactly what the Talmud says. It says, pour the second cup, right? We're familiar with that. Actually, the Talmud says mix the second cup, because the way people drank wine in antiquity is that they had like a wine extract that they would mix with water and stir it up. Mix the second cup, you're not drinking it yet. And then it says, V'kan ha-ben shoel et aviv. And here, at this point, the son asks the father. So far, so good. But if the son is not discerning, if he doesn't understand, right? Aviv milamdo, his father teaches him. Colon. Manishtana halal. In other words, in the Mishnah, in its original form, who is saying this, the Manishtana? It is the father to the child, not the child asking the father. And that makes a lot of sense, because in fact, this is asking about things that haven't happened yet in some cases. And right, so the child doesn't have any experience. It says, well, on all of the nights we dip once, but tonight we dip twice. Well, he hasn't come to the second dipping. How does he know we dip twice, right? Why would he ask that, right? On all other nights we eat matzah or bread, regular bread, but tonight only matzah. Well, how does he know that? There is matzah, but how does he know there's only matzah, right? So what we have here is not questions. We have the father pointing out things to the child. So, manishtana halayla hazeh mikol halayla. See how different this night is from all other nights. That's what manishtana means. Just as manora hamakom hazeh. How awesome is this place? Right? See, it's manora hamakom hazeh, manishtana halayla hazeh, right? How different, the father is saying, is this from all other nights? And then the father goes on and he says, on all other nights we eat leavened bread or matzah. Tonight we'll only eat matzah. We eat vegetables, but tonight only bitter herbs, and so on, right? On all other nights we can recline or not. Tonight we recline, right? At which point, having pointed out the differences, the child now will ask why. Why is this so different? Right? Because he didn't get it. He didn't notice it. But now, because it's been pointed out to him. So I want to give you, this actually happened at a seder that I had, where, and the rabbis say, if the kid asks a question, no need for the manishtana. It actually says that in the Talmud, right? I was at a seder, my nephew, Tzvi, who was a little kid at the time, we were there, and it seemed like a regular holiday or Shabbos dinner, right? We started out, we made Kiddush, right? Went to wash hands. We do that on Friday nights. And then, what do? We take parsley and dip it in salt water or something like that, right? And my nephew said, where's the challah? Right? Where's the challah? Because that's what should have been, right? That's what's supposed to happen. That's what's supposed to happen, right? Doesn't happen. The father is supposed to point out the difference. This is original. This isn't what it means for us today, right? Because here's the problem. We're not only supposed to transmit the memory of the Exodus, but if you look literally at what the Torah says, tell your child when they ask. That's what it says, right? In other words, in strictly speaking, I can't perform the mitzvah of telling my child until my child asks. How do I get them to ask? I do all kinds of weird things. I dip parsley, all kinds of things which are not ordinarily done. And therefore, hopefully it will prompt them to ask a question because it's supposed to be a real question. Okay, so now, of course, that's not what we do. What we do is often to say, who's the youngest child, perhaps, if they, right? And it's great because you're feeling like, oh, look, they learned something in religious school or at day school, right? And they can show off and we can feel great, right? And more than that, they're engaged and involved. So I'm not arguing that the father should say manishtana. Yeah, give me 1 second. Okay, I'm not arguing that the father should say manishtana because Jewish rituals change and change meaning over time, but it's worth noting what it originally meant. Okay, so much for the manishtana. And now we get what are commonly called, used to be called the 4 sons, right? And these days we speak about the 4 children. One who is wise, one who is contrary, one who is simple, and one who doesn't know how to ask. And it's introduced by saying, the Torah speaks of 4 children. Okay? Guess what? The Torah doesn't speak of 4 children. If you go looking in the Torah for the 4 children, you're not going to find them. So what does it mean that the Torah speaks of 4 children? It's a midrash. It's a very clever rabbinic midrash. There are 4 times in the Torah where it tells us to tell our children about the Exodus. And each time it's a little bit different. When your child asks, what are the meaning of the laws and customs, you should tell them about the Exodus. When your child asks, what is this maha avodah hazot lahem? What is this ritual to you? You should tell them about the Exodus. When your child says, what is this? You should tell them about the Exodus. And the 4th one, tell your child about the Exodus. Doesn't say anything about it, right? So there is a sophisticated question, perhaps a sarcastic question, at least it could be read that way. It is read that way by the rabbis. There's a very simple question, what is this? And then you're supposed to tell him even when he doesn't ask, right? So the rabbis took those 4 verses, which say, tell your child about the Exodus from Egypt, and they used each one to create this midrash about 4 different kinds of children, right? Now, what's it doing here? What's it doing here? And I want to suggest to you that this is meant for the leader of the seder. It's advice. So far, we've gotten our child to ask a question. Now, how are we going to respond to that question? And the answer is, Kedat haben aviv melamdo. What it says in the Mishnah is, the father should answer according to the understanding of his child, right? Which means you can't just rattle off the same answer. Any teacher knows that you have to meet your student where they are. Famous story, a joke really. Child comes home from school and she says, Mom, what is sex? And the mother is like, oh God, I knew this day was going to come. What am I going to say? And starts talking about men and women and babies. And the kid says, no, I had to fill out this form. It says sex, and there's an M and an F, and I didn't know what it meant, right? So the idea here is, you got to know your kid. You got to know what they're asking. You got to know who they are, right? In order to transmit from generation to generation, you have to know what kind of child you have, right? So is it a really smart kid who's curious and interested? Then you have to give one kind of answer, right? Because you're really going to give them the details and try to explain it because they're going to really appreciate it. What if they're contrary and sarcastic? What's the meaning of this to you? Right? Like this thing that you're doing, this ritual, right? To you, because I'm a sophisticated kid. I live in the world and this stuff, right? So that's a different kind of question. And you can't just say, get out of here. You have to try to reach him. Now, the way the Torah, the Midrash suggests you reach him is a little harsh, right? This is what God did for me. If you had been there, God would not have done that for you, because in fact, you would have excluded yourself, right? But the point is, you're trying to reach him. And if it's a simple child, don't go talking about the birds and the bees, right? What is this? Well, this is matzah, and this is maror, and we eat this, because our ancestors did, and we eat this because it's bitter, right? And if he doesn't know how to ask, then you got to find a way to talk to him. You got to get him to ask. And the other thing is, it's got to be about asking, because that's the best kind of education. because if a child is asking, then he's curious, or she, right? And then the answer is going to land and it's going to be remembered. If you can get their curiosity, then it's going to stick, right? And I think as pedagogy, the Haggadah is brilliant in this regard. And by the way, the Haggadah also tries to reach us in all different kinds of ways, right? Through the texts, through tasting, through seeing, through hearing as we sing, right? It tries to engage all of our senses in some way, and it tries to do it in a curious way, because that's what's going to stick. So we're almost out of time. I want to say a few more things, but before I do, I'm going to change the view. Any questions up to this point about the Manishtana or Halachma Onya or the 4 children? Anything at all? Okay, Walter and then Carol. Go ahead. Unmute, of course.
Okay, Rabbi Warmflesh, conceivably, you could have a seder without the Haggadah, correct? If everybody agreed to have a discussion about the Exodus from Egypt without the text, and they were serious in pursuing meaningful answers or pursuing important questions, as you point out, you could have a seder, couldn't you?
Well, so not quite, but kind of. So if you look at which seder means order, right?
Right.
So there are a series of actions which are supposed to be engaged in at a seder, right? You're supposed to make kiddush, right? You're supposed to do some dipping, right? You're supposed to break a matzah. And these are not long, right? They're very simple kinds of things. And then if you look, we sometimes kiddush, right? Orcha, karpas, right? And we get to magid in that order. Magid is telling the story or testifying, right? So do you need the 4 questions, and do you need the sons, and do you need all those verses? Probably not, strictly speaking. That whole thing, which is called magid or telling, could be very free form. But you do need, if you're going to do a seder, and seder means order, that there is stuff that you need. You need Hallel, which are psalms of praise, right? That's part. So what I want to say is, yeah, it could be very, very streamlined. And in fact, a lot of the rabbinic material you could substitute for something contemporary, and you would still be within the context of what's called the seder, but not quite dispensing with everything. And Carol.
Along that line, do you use a Haggadah or do you write your own?
Okay, so what we do is we use a Haggadah, but particularly when you get to the Midrash section, my father was a wandering Aramean. They went down few in number and all of that. We tend to read selectively from that part of a few passages that we can discuss. I actually ask people, I give people assignments in advance, things to think about and to present, right? So, and I find that, and I try to tie them to specific places, but they're much more general. Who is a slave today? What's our obligation to the poor? Who were these rabbis who sat at B'nai Brak? Do a little research and enlighten us, right? So I think that it's not that we write a text so much, but I do think a good seder really takes planning. Sometimes we'll distribute things. Sometimes we'll do readings, and they're, you remember perhaps during the time of when Soviet Jewry was, we're trying to get them out of Egypt. There used to be something called the matzah of hope. There are people who put,
Yes.
they put an orange on the seder, Miriam's cup, right?
Mhm.
Have a cup to remember Miriam, right? So all of these things, these sort of innovation, I think are great. I really do, because they make it contemporary and enliven it. But no, I don't actually write a Haggadah.
So which Haggadah do you use?
So we have used a number of different ones. The Rabbinical Assembly published one years ago, which we use one night, and then there's a very traditional Haggadah that we use another night, and that, you know, that it's kind of orange and red. It's
Yeah.
a little bit like the Maxwell House, but a later. And I like to have lots of Haggadot around, different Haggadot that people can look at and maybe read something to us from. So I mean, that's a little harder, you know, because you're asking people to both be in the Seder and go, you know, and sometimes we read together, so we all need to have the same text. But sometimes I'll say, oh, what does it say in your Haggadah about this, right? And I'll invite people to share. So,
Thank
okay.
you.
Sure. Okay, so we're almost out of time. So I guess in some ways, what I want to say as kind of final advice for doing a Seder is be relaxed about it, but prepare, right? In other words, it can kind of take its own course. You know, if you study Talmud, what you see is it doesn't look like an outline. It's like major topics, minor topics, you know, subtopics. That's not how the Talmud works. The Talmud works like, well, you're having a discussion about this, and it reminds you of that, and you go. One of my favorite questions is, how did your family get here to America? Because that's often a story of slavery to freedom, right? And this is also about, you know, where we've come from, the Seder in general. So I think free form and discussion in part is a good way to go. Being mindful of your audience is really important. If you've got a lot of little kids, you know, then you're not going to have the same Seder that you're going to have with adults, older children and adults. And, you know, that's okay, because really, if the focus is on the next generation, you want to start early enough that they're still awake when it comes to Mani Shtana, right? Now, in theory, I mean, according to Jewish law, you really can't start until the sun goes down. You're really not supposed to, right? And that's, you know, that's later, particularly now as the clock has changed. If you have little kids, I would not wait. Because again, you want them alert, and you want them up, and you want them engaged. I think the afikomen is really important. Because, by the way, you start by breaking the matzah, right? And then you say to the kid, watch this. Keep your eye on this, right? Which is also the leader. This is going to go somewhere, and then you're going to find it, and then you're going to come back, or I'll find it, or I like this idea that the kid finds it and then they bargain, right? I like that a lot because they're really engaged. And the other thing is, what are you really doing when you bargain with a child? You're giving them power, right? Because you can't go on until this negotiation has ended and you can eat the afikomen, right? Until you eat the afikomen, you can't go on. So what does it mean to be a slave? It means to have no power. And in some, by the way, tomorrow they better do what we tell them to do, right? But for a moment, you're really giving this person who has no power ordinarily a fair amount of power. course, you can always threaten, okay, we'll start again. We'll make another Afikomen, right? We do have our ways of making sure that we move on. Anyway, I want to wish you all, yes, Saul, go ahead, unmute.
Yeah, I wanted to mention something. The last son, I noticed this in all the years I've been doing a seder. V'she'eno yodea lish'o at. They changed from ata, from the masculine to the feminine.
Yes.
At to tachlo.
Yes, so at and ata in rabbinic literature are kind of fluid.
Oh,
So at can be ata, but I like your reading of it, right? Because in fact, at is feminine, and therefore you, a woman, open for her. And I think, that's a way of making it relevant to our own time and our own understanding. So you could translate it, and if he has no understanding, she opens for him, right? Also, I like that word patach, to open, right? You're opening the child. You're somehow opening them up to possibilities, opening them up to see things that they didn't see before. I mean, the truth is we could take almost any passage in this and we could talk about it for an hour. So, and I suggest you do, and I suggest that as you have your discussions, assume that there are no wrong answers. See where it takes you. Don't feel that you have to have the authoritative answer. This is what that means. It means what it means to you. It's supposed to be a living experience. The worst thing you can do at a seder, in my opinion, is daven the Haggadah. Mumble your way through it. That's not what a seder is meant to be in any way, right? I know there's some very traditional people who do just that. Well, I want to tell you, they may be very traditional, but in this case, they're out of the tradition. Because that's not what those rabbis at B'nai Brak all night long, they weren't davening. Believe me, they weren't davening. Okay, so again, I'll mention to you what I mentioned at the beginning for those who weren't here. We're not meeting next week. People are going to be busy getting their houses, I hope, ready and everything else. We're not meeting during the week of Pesach. We're going to resume afterwards. We'll be then going with one exception, probably into June. We're going to finish the book of Numbers for sure this year. And maybe, depending on how quickly we finish Numbers, we may look at one or two other small things as well. Okay, so I wish you a great Yantiv, a Zisen Pesach, a Hag Kasher V'Sameach, a joyous and kosher Passover, and all those other things. And I hope to see you in 3 weeks. All right, everybody.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I
Passover.
Thank
speak for myself. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to say thank you
Oh,
on
you're
behalf
very,
of me, and I'm sure of the group. Thank you for your knowledge and your wisdom and your engagement. Thank
yeah,
you.
you're very welcome. And
Thank
I
you
wanna-
so much.
And I
Thank
want to
you,
thank
Rabbi.
you for, I want to thank you
Thank
for
you, Rabbi.
being
Happy
the
Passover.
audience, because I love doing this and you
It's
give me
very
an
clear.
opportunity to do it. All right, everybody, take care now.
that's
Bye.